Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the sixth and, for the time being, the final installment of my Jewish library. I had wanted to and will eventually in the future do a class on a number of unique books in my library and other ritual items in my home. But that will have to wait until after Pesach. Beginning tomorrow, God willing, I'll start to send out, we'll start to discuss the Haggadah and various classes on some ideas in the Haggadah, some things to prepare us for the Passover Seder, especially in this difficult year. I wanted to round out today by reviewing with you briefly sort of the sequence of the books and the types of books in the library, and then talk about two particularly modern books of interest. So again, just by way of reminder, we start with the Bible. Everything starts in here, the Bible and the Chumash. Okay? The first works of the oral Torah, the first works that we have after the Bible is the Mishnah. The Mishnah becomes the basis of the Talmud, which eventually fills up these many, many, many books. You have Maimonides' Code, the Code of Jewish Law, which is based on the Torah. We talked about yesterday how the Torah became the basis for this, but these are codes of Jewish law. Various more modern codes. And today we're going to look at two other modern works that are of particular interest. So let's have a seat and let's talk about the Gers Moshe. So the Gers Moshe, the word Igros literally means letters, and Moshe is for Rav Moshe Feinstein of blessed memory, who was arguably the leading halakhic authority of the second half of the 20th century. Rav Moshe would write what were known as tshuvos. Tshuvos are Shelos for Tshuvos, are questions and answers that are addressed about a topic to a rabbi about a topic that's not quite as apparent as something you could easily find in the book. The reason why the Gers Moshe is particularly interesting is that it's the first and certainly the most popular of the responsa that was written in the modern era, and so it addresses many questions that you would not have seen previously. So let me just give you an example of something that the Gers Moshe would tackle. Bidvar bat mitzvah, the question of whether it's permissible to have a bat mitzvah. Now, this question was answered many years ago, and it's not really important for the moment what Rav Moshe answers and how Rav Moshe says you should handle such a thing. What is significant is that the question was asked. It's a question that you would not have found in Maimonides. You would not have found in the Code of Jewish Law. It's a modern situation which has come up, and Rav Moshe, in addressing it, tries to clarify whether or not such a thing should be done and based on what, etc., and looks for, and here's the key word, precedents on which to base his ruling. Rav Moshe doesn't want to make up a ruling all by himself. What Rav Moshe is looking to do is to try wherever possible to root his thought and his rulings in the classic sources, wherever possible, at least to use them as a jumping off point. Let me give you another example of questions that Rav Moshe covers. Be'inyan lahadlik et hagaz meha-pilot light ulahaktin ha'esh b'yom tov. So here the question is, can you, on Yom Tov, on Shabbos, the ovens are not supposed to get turned on. But on Yom Tov, there is leniency, because unlike on Shabbos, where you cannot handle a flame in any way, on Yom Tov, you can use a pre-existing flame even to cook. So the question is, I get a pre-existing flame, is the pilot light in a gas oven, which is always on before the Carter administration, I think it was the Carter administration that got rid of those, but anyway, the pilot light, which is always on, is that considered a pre-existing light so that you can just turn on the oven based off the pilot light? And nowadays, we're not so lucky. Almost none of us have ovens with pilot lights. You'd have to have a fairly old oven at this point to have pilot lights. But what's significant is that Rav Moshe is grappling with an issue that really never existed before his time. There were no gas ovens. So now that there are gas ovens, how do I handle gas ovens? How do I handle the particular of the gas oven? Another example, can I take the flame, which I wouldn't be able to do normally on Shabbos, can I go up and down with the flame? Right? So on Shabbos, sometimes you can leave a flame on with a black and a covering, whatever the details are. On Yom Tov, in theory, you can increase and reduce the flame, and Rav Moshe discusses that. Rav Moshe also was the first to discuss most of the medical ethics issues that came up, and he did so with a lot of assistance from Rav Tendler, who, as a doctor, was able to provide him with a great deal of information and background on a lot of the questions. So that's one of the modern books I wanted to point out. There's one other I want to point out just because it is so frequently referred to. And down here, this is known as the Mission of Brewer. The Mission of Brewer is another modern work. This was done, it was edited by Rav Yisrael Meir Kagan, the Chafetz Chaim, in the early 20th century. And what this book does is it takes the Shulchan Aruch and it elucidates where common practice was at the time that the Mission of Brewer was writing it, which would make it easier for people to observe in general, which was part of the idea, is to have a very direct, succinct commentary that elucidated to some degree what the practice was. And for that matter, the Mission of Brewer also gives you a snapshot of sort of what practice was at a particular time in history, which in itself can be very interesting. One last note on the Shulchan Aruch, the Mission of Brewer, I should say. The one last note on the Mission of Brewer, who's quoting the Shulchan Aruch. I wanted to mention this yesterday when we talked about the Shulchan Aruch, but I neglected to. The Shulchan Aruch was written by Rav Yosef Karo. Rav Yosef Karo was a Sephardi. Sephardim and Ashkenazim, they have many, many different practices on some very, very basic things. So the question is, well, how do you manage that? And the answer is that along with the Shulchan Aruch, along with the writing of the Code of Jewish Law, subsequent to that, Rav Moshe Isserles from Poland, Krakow, Poland, Rav Moshe Isserles wrote glosses, wrote notes on the rulings, the Sephardic rulings of the Shulchan Aruch. Rav Yosef Karo, he wrote notes for the practice of Ashkenazim, where the practice of Ashkenazim either differs or there's an additional practice. He wrote those in. So we have sort of the Ashkenaz notes. It's primarily written by a Sephardi, but where it differs, the Ashkenazi chips in, and those are known as Hagaz. Those are notes that were written by the Ramah, standing for Moshe Isserles, so that we Ashkenazim should not feel disenfranchised anyway from the Shulchan Aruch. But seriously, it gave an opportunity for Ashkenazim to make the Shulchan Aruch their most common book of reference as well. This is particularly profound because over time it has led to, especially in the modern era, but has really opened the door to, by using a single source that quotes both, it sort of opened the door to more blending of the common practices of Sephardim and Ashkenazim, more of a unity of practice between the two, which is certainly valuable. I want to thank you for joining me for these 6 sessions, and I want to tell you that we will be back. I have a number of very, very odd and interesting books that I'd like to share with you from my library, but that'll have to wait till after Passover. Beginning tomorrow, God willing, we'll be taking a look at the Haggadah, various ideas in the Haggadah, and preparing ourselves for the Passover Seder this coming year. Thanks for being with us. Have a beautiful day.